We're
Okay, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
That's all right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Charles Sterling for another one of the Power BI and Power Apps webinars. Joining me this morning, we've got Kasper de Jonge, or actually as it's evening for him. The reason I was laughing is the famous last words. Right as I hit the button, he was saying, "Don't start yet." So, you know, typical professionalism that we've got, that's when I hit the button. Today, he's actually going to be talking about Power BI security. He's actually presented this at a couple times in Amsterdam and throughout Europe, and he says that this actually really resonates well with people. I know I just came back from the Focus Summit where Ted Pattison actually went out and covered the same topic, and everybody loved it. So again, with a lot of popular requests, we had to put Kasper on the radio or on actually in this webinar. So Kasper, I should do an introduction for you, but I'm going to leave that to you, and I'm going to hand it directly over to you. We're going to be inside of the YouTube channel to go out and take your calls or your questions through the Q&A window. You can't talk to Kasper, but I'll be asking him those questions. And hopefully Olivier can rejoin, because I bounced him out because we had an open mic, and it was actually a second mic that I had. We don't know how. So Olivier, hopefully you can rejoin and you can actually ask the questions as well. Kasper, over to you, my friend.
All right, thank you. So good morning, good evening, you are. My name is Kasper de Jonge, and I'm a senior program manager on the Power BI team. And I think Charles and I were talking about this earlier. One of the most popular topics and people want to know a lot of information about is about the security of Power BI. Of course, we have the Power BI security white paper that actually covers almost everything that I'm going to talk about today. But I'm going to make it a bit more friendly so that you can explain some of these topics. But as this is going to be recorded on YouTube as well, I would definitely recommend you to also use that as the latest and greatest information, because as you know, Power BI is super fast and we update regularly. So whatever I tell you now, probably in 6 months, things will have changed. Then because it's on YouTube, it will live forever. So with that, let's go and take a look at what we're going to cover today. So the things that we're going to talk about today is all around security. But security has lots and different aspects. And the things that we're going to talk about is the first thing in security is to make sure that we know who the user is. Who is actually logging into Power BI and how can we trust who this user is? And what are the options that I have to do stuff with this user account? And the second thing is, of course, also very popular, and this is mostly across Europe, but how does Microsoft make sure that my data is secure? When I store data, how do I know it is secure, and how does Microsoft take precautions to make it secure? And we'll cover that as well. The third topic is compliance and market availability. There's lots of rules and regulations, and we'll quickly cover this as well. What's the current state? And which markets do we have Power BI available? And again, as this is moving quickly and rapidly, so whatever I'll cover today, make sure you go to look at the Power BI white paper and the Power BI Trust Center to always be able to get the latest and greatest. And the last thing, and what we're going to look at is, okay, so how can we make sure we share your data? So in the previous topics, we've looked at, okay, how can Microsoft and how will Microsoft secure your data? But how can you yourself take actions to secure data as well? Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and take a step into the first direction. We're going to talk about user identity first. So what is user identity? Well, user identity is whoever you are and whoever has access to Power BI. And one of the important things to recognize here is that Power BI is part of the larger Microsoft Cloud. We run everything ourselves on Azure. So we're not making new things up. We're not coming up with new parts of, we didn't build our own security system, user identity system, or things like this. No, we are reusing the security system built in Azure, and we're reusing Azure Active Directory. So this means that if you already have an Azure Active Directory that is signed up and connected to your other Azure services, we can reuse this. So let's say you've already set up Office 365. You already have an Office 365 tenant. You already have your users in your organization using SharePoint and Exchange using Office 365. Then when you log into Power BI, it's automatically set up. So you don't have to do anything. And in general, the way that Azure Active Directory works is we take care of all these things for you under the covers. So when you sign in with a username and password the first time into Power BI, we automatically create Azure Directory under the covers, and you won't even recognize and know that it's there. But if you already have used it for a different service or a different tenant, then we have automatically taken care of this, and we automatically connect to this Azure Active Directory tenant. So the good thing here is that this Azure Active Directory or AAD will be used to secure all of your Microsoft resources with a common set of users and groups. So let's say you use Office 365, you use CRM Online, you use Dynamics, Flow, apps, all of these things. You will use a single Azure Active Directory and a single username and a password to log into all these Microsoft Cloud services. And again, you don't have to do anything for it. We will automatically make it work. Now, the good thing is, of course, that by us using the fact that we are using Azure Active Directory, we can leverage all of its components. And this means, for example, that we can also leverage the way that we can set it up. So, for example, often, in majority of the cases, you do not want to start from scratch. So you want to choose your identity infrastructure in a way that makes sense to you. So maybe you already have managed identity somewhere, and you just want to use a password sync to sync the identities back and forth. Or when you use federated identities, you can use ADFS or third-party STS to connect to your Azure Active Directory. But probably the most common case, which we see with the majority of our customers, is that you already have an on-premise Active Directory or IDM already set up and managed, and then you can set up AD Connect, so you only have to manage it once. And this means that whenever you add a new user to your local AD with a username and a password, it automatically gets synced to Azure Active Directory, and now the users can also sign in with Power BI with the same credentials as they do with on-prem. So you only have to manage it once. And so Microsoft and Power BI uses Azure Active Directory to do authentication, log into Power BI. Now, the good thing is that every user, and it's the way we've set it up, every user can sign up for a free Power BI license. So when you go to Power BI for the first time, and let's say no one has signed up from your organization to Power BI ever, what we will do is we'll give you a free Power BI license. And if no one in your company has ever signed up for Azure Active Directory with your domain name, we will create one as well. For example, in my case, well, the chances are small, but let's say no one from Microsoft would have ever gone into Azure Active Directory and set it up, then I would have been the one who created the Azure Active Directory domain for the first time. Now, later, and the same thing goes for Power BI, when the IT department actually comes in and says, hey, who created this thing? They can actually do an admin takeover and actually take over the Azure Active Directory tenant. The other interesting thing is we want every user to sign up to Power BI for free and to be able to play with the data and get to their insights that they can use. So we want people to be able to sign up for free, but sometimes organizations say, no, we do not want people to sign up for free, and this can be turned off by the admin, and we'll cover this in more details in a second. So user identity. So now that we've seen what the user identity is, it's an identity in Azure Active Directory. It can be synced between Azure Active Directory on-prem and the cloud, and now we know who the user is. So how does it work with Power BI? How does it work when I want to log into Power BI, and what are the steps that we do? Well, the first thing that you'll see here is, of course, we have a browser, and you go to app.powerbi.com or www.powerbi.com to sign in. That will redirect you to app.powerbi.com. And imagine in my case, well, I'm in the Netherlands today, but my Power BI tenant is in the US. What will happen is when I go to app.powerbi.com, I'll go to an Azure Traffic Manager. The Azure Traffic Manager will figure out where I'm at in the world and go back to my browser and tell me. That will redirect me to a web front end in ASP running ASP.NET. The web front end is being located in the closest data center are where I'm at. So it already figured out I'm in the Netherlands. So we'll probably go to the West Europe data center because it's in Amsterdam. And in the West Europe data center, it will run the Power BI web frontend. The web frontend then will call the Microsoft login page, because we don't even know who I am at this point. We just know I'm a user of Power BI who wants to log in, and he's in the Netherlands. So he opens up a Microsoft login page. You've all seen the pop-up show up. I log in with my Microsoft account. That goes to AD, Azure AD, and then in Azure AD, now I actually know, oh, it's Kasper at Microsoft. The next thing we'll do is we'll actually look into an Azure table we've set up, where we have a global service that actually tells us that Microsoft.com domain, the tenant is hosted somewhere in the US. I don't know exactly where the Microsoft tenant is, but I know it's somewhere in the US. So it is somewhere in the US. It tells the browser again. The browser then will start loading common content, things like CSS files, JavaScript files, images, and things like this from Azure CDN. And again, this is just some stuff, static information that is used by everyone. It's the same things. It's no data of you. It's just static information that is coming from the CDN that is closest to you. Then the last step, and how things become interesting, what it will then do is redirect me to the backend service. And the backend service is the stuff where reports get rendered using your data. That backend service is running in your tenant. It doesn't run anywhere else in the world. It's running in your tenant. And we'll get back to backend service a bit further down the line, but this is how the authentication flow works. So the authentication flow will happen closest to where you are in the world until it figures out where you live and which tenant belongs to your domain. As soon as it figures out where that is, it will go to the backend service that is running on the tenant where you have your data stored. So that's in short how the authentication steps of Power BI work. And again, most of this information comes from the Power BI security white paper. So if you want to know more details about this, you can go to the Power BI security white paper and read up all about it in more details. But there are some things in here that are not part of this, because, for example, this one is not. Because we're leveraging Azure Active Directory, some of the cool things you can do to enhance your security is you can, for example, go ahead and turn on multi-factor authentication. So you can actually say, hey, if your user wants to log into Power BI, it has to have two-factor authentication turned on. Otherwise, you cannot log in. You can either go enable this through the Office 365 admin portal, where you can tell your users to be able to log in, or you can use Azure Active Directory Premium. You need to have either an Office 365 license, or you need to have Azure Active Directory Premium to enable this. Now, once you enable multi-factor authentication, you can get all these cool things like phone calls, text message, Azure Authenticator app, or when you have an on-premise IDP, you can actually leverage anything this IDP supports. So again, as an admin, you can control how your users can access Power BI, and all leveraging the Azure services. We haven't built anything ourselves. We're just leveraging Azure Active Directory here. One of the other great things here is that the things that we support is, again, user access control, is that we can tell our users if they want to use the mobile applications, for example, that they need to use a PIN. So if you want to open this app and sign in with your username and password, and you've set this policy, then it will automatically tell you, hey, you need to sign in. And you need to have a PIN on your device enabled, otherwise you can't. And this is done through Intune. So you can control this through Intune using Power BI mobile apps on iOS and Android. And there you can control these things like enabling PIN. You can have a company portal app. So some users, some companies don't allow people to just go with their device and go to the Apple App Store and buy stuff. They want to control it through a company app. And with Intune, all of this is available inside of your for your Power BI users as well. And again, all of this is documented in the Power BI documentation. This is not in the security white paper, but there's a document available here as well. So you can use access control for two-factor authentication and even for your mobile devices when people want to log into Power BI. The last one, and this actually came out pretty recent, and this one is my favorite. There's also something called conditional access. And conditional access allows you to conditionize the way that people can access your data. So for example, you could say, okay, when you log into Power BI, I only want you to be able to log in from Power BI when you're inside the organization's building. So you can control which IP ranges can connect. And when someone is inside of your organization, this is your IP range. Or I want to say you can only connect with Microsoft Service Books to a Power BI service. Or you can say only when you're part of a certain group in Azure Active Directory can you connect to Power BI. Or you can say, and you can start making combinations. This is the part that I really like. Is you can say, and this is also some of the stuff that we have inside of Microsoft. For example, when I am part of, when I VPN in to our Microsoft corporate domain, even when I'm outside of the organization, outside of CorpNet, I never have to do two-factor authentication. Because the cool thing is, it is kind of considered as a two-factor authentication because I can log into a Microsoft laptop, I can connect to VPN, and then I can connect to Power BI. Of course, I still have to know my username and password, but I don't have to do the two-factor authentication because I already did two things. And so you can mix and match here. And you can say things like, only when this sort of people, a group log in, they always have to do two-factor authentication. Or when you're on CorpNet, you never have to do two-factor authentication. So you can start doing combinations left and right about all of this stuff. And you can really tighten down who can access Power BI, and you control the circumstances. All right. The last part here is admin control. And this is not necessarily a part of Azure Active Directory, but there are some configurations you can do as an admin as well. For example, as an admin, you can control sign up. You can control whether or not users can self-sign up to Power BI. And then you can add them manually. Of course, this configuration is shared with Office 365. We've even seen some customers do, is actually pretty cool, is that they've turned off self-sign up to Power BI. And they actually created a intranet form, just an ASP.NET web application, where users have to type in a username and password, or they actually have to type in why they want to have access to Power BI. And they give some rules and some reasons. And then they say, okay, I submit. And then under the covers, as soon as the form has been submitted, they have written some code using the Office 365 APIs to give the user a Power BI license. And now, from this moment on, he can log in. It's all automated process. But they just wanted to have this additional step built in that users go to an internet portal and actually sign up the reason, and they kind of consent to using Power BI. And they automated that we can actually sign up to Power BI and give them a license. The other thing as well, and this is the first part is mostly shared with Office 365. The second part is more about Power BI itself. So one of the areas that we're investing in heavily, which you've already seen recently probably, is that we are adding much more fine-grained admin controls. So we're doing things like who can share content within my organization, who can export data, who can create content packs, and much more to come. This is one of those areas that we're investing in heavily. So what you've seen is the user identity is key here, and user identity is shared with Office 365 and also leveraging Azure Active Directory. We're leveraging all the areas and the features that Azure Active Directory has to offer. So if you turn on two-factor authentication, this automatically works with Power BI as well. You can use many of the admin features that Office 365 has to offer, because we are like a tiered layer. First Azure Active Directory, then Office 365, and then Power BI on top. And as last, we also have a lot of fine-grained admin controls that allows you to control what users can do. So with that, what I wanted to do is do a quick demo of this, because most of you here are probably in the same boat as I am. You probably have never seen the admin controls, because I am not an admin on the Microsoft tenant, as you can imagine. Neither are probably most of you. So I do want to do a quick demo of what this looks like and what are the functionality and the features of the admin portal, because yeah, not many of us actually get to see this. So what I have here is my Power BI, and again, very simple, just a regular Power BI. What I want to do here is I'm actually go in here and go to the admin portal. You see it on top and right here. And when I click on the admin portal, it opens up the admin portal. And the first thing that it shows me here is my usage metrics. And again, this is an important area. I don't have to be anything else than a Power BI admin to be able to see this. I don't have to go to Office or anything like this. This is directly inside of Power BI. The main goal of the usage metrics here is to track what people are doing with Power BI. And again, this also is an area that we're investing in heavily. We want to be able to give you more governance. We want you to be able to see what people are doing with your products, with the dashboards that you're building, with the reports that are building, and also who's actually using all of this stuff and why. So all of this you can see here. So you can see things like numbers of dashboards, number of user reports, number of data sets, the top users, most consumed dashboards, and of course is a fake tenant. So there's not a lot. Consumer packages, how many group dashboards do we have, data sets, which packages are consumed. So all these things are here available. And again, this is for us to be able to give you governance. Who can do what and who's using these dashboards and these data sets. And this is just the beginning, we're extending on this. The second item that is available here is the users tab. And here I can manage users and I can go to Office 365 and administer them. I'm not going to show these because it's rather boring. It's just a list of users. It's not too interesting. The one that is interesting though is audit logs. And the audit logs is the one that actually tracks and leaves the audit trail of what people are doing within Power BI. So you do need to have access to the Office 365 admin center. So you click on this guy and brings me over to the Office 365 security and compliance part. And what you see here is there's a lots of activities that you can filter on. Here, there's things like you can go in and say things like, I want to see Microsoft Teams, Dynamics, e-discovery, but in this case, I've turned on my Power BI activities. And you can track things like who has viewed a dashboard, who has deleted the dashboard, who has exported the dashboard, started a trial, analyzed the Power BI data set, deleted the reports, and so on and so on. So you can track all of this. And once you start, this starts to track all this information. So you can see that Adam at the measured product viewed a Power BI dashboard called Human Resource Samples, and it did it from this IP address. And in this case, I didn't do a data classification. I'll show you this in a second. But you can also do this if you set a data classification. You can look at the information by highly classified, less classified, and things like this. There are several things that you can do here. One, of course, you can follow the audit trail. You can go here into this UI and actually go ahead and play with it. Or you can export the results and then use your favorite tool, I would say Power BI Desktop, probably, to analyze the information here. The other option is, and Chuck was just telling me earlier as well, he has a blog post on this, and where you can actually go ahead and export the information from this audit log, like in an automated process, and then load them into Power BI Desktop as well. And then you can start analyzing what's going on here. But the big difference between the two, and today it's not as clear yet because we don't have as much features today available in the usage part, but the idea is this is really for auditing. Something went wrong, or we want to figure out and we want to check upon what some users are doing. And this is really what the auditing feature is. The auditing feature is really for auditing. To actually do usage tracking and things like this, you should be able to use the usage part of it. because this one also needs you to have much more Office 365 admin privileges, where the previous one, you can just get a Power BI admin privileges and you should be done. But again, it is here. There's lots of information here. So maybe inside of your organization, you have never seen this and you would like to get to this information, talk to your Office 365 admin, and maybe he can give you maybe the export result sets every now and then. So you can actually track and you can actually play with this information yourself. Okay. Well, there's more. If I go back to the admin center, the last part as well is the tenant settings. And again, you see a huge list here of items that allow you to control what you can do. For example, if I want to share content with external users. So in this case, I want everyone in my organization to be able to share content with external users. But what I also can do is turn it off. I can disable it, or I can enable it for just specific security groups. Or I can only accept specific security groups. So enable it for some, but exclude it for others. So I can actually start playing with all of this stuff. I'm going to cancel it out. The other thing I can control is publish to web. So I can turn off publish to web for everyone. Exporting of data. In this case, I have it disabled, but you can enable it as well. Export reports as PowerPoint. Printing, you can disable or enable printing. Content packs, template organizations, Cortana, analytics, analyze Excel, ArcGIS maps, interact and share R visuals, auditing logs, the one I just showed you, you can disable it as well. Usage metrics, turn on or off. And the last thing is the data classification I talked about earlier. So here, one of the things you can do is you can turn on data classification. This allows your users to classify their dashboards. HBI, high business input, confidential, top secret, low business impact, high business impact, and things like this. And then you can go back to the auditing trail and say, okay, so who has looked at my high business impact dashboards? Did I actually secure it as well as I wanted to do? So you can create your own classifications here. You can tell Power BI what is the default one. So by default, all the dashboards will be low business impact and things like this. So that's also a pretty valuable feature. So in short, this is the Power BI admin part. So let's continue with some of the other interesting topics. So the most interesting one is, of course, data security. And what does data security mean? Well, data security means you have data that you put inside of Power BI. How does Microsoft secure that data? And of course, this is the topic that people want to know how it works exactly. And this is what we describe in details in the Power BI security white paper. But I'll cover it here as well. So, but before we go there, let's really understand what types of data there are in Power BI. Of course, Power BI is a Power BI reports and dashboards page in the SaaS service. The SaaS service uses Azure Active Directory. It is synced usually with on-prem, but doesn't necessarily have to be. That's why the dotted line. And it uses data from all kinds of data sources. Some cloud sources directly. Maybe you use CRM Online, maybe you use Salesforce, maybe you use GitHub, maybe you use Marketo, any of these services to create dashboards, or you have some data sitting on premise, maybe a SQL or an Oracle or a Spark or an analysis services database, and you bring them all together either through a live connection or a scheduled refresh. So putting it all together, you can access data any way you like, but there are mainly three types. You can either import data, and when you import data, you open up Power BI Desktop, you import the data, and you then publish it to Power BI. Then that data is moved to Power BI, and it's leveraging its in-memory engine. When you then want to schedule a refresh, the credentials need to be saved inside of Power BI to be able to refresh. And we'll go into more details on where credentials actually are stored in a second, because it kind of relies on where the data source is, but in general, when you import data, that data is going to move to Power BI. When you have a live connection or a direct query source, then the data stays in its original location. So when you connect to an analyst services or a SQL database in either direct query or live connection mode, then that data will stay in its original location and will not move to Power BI. We do need to use, do need to have credentials or passes the username directly to the data source. And the last type is when you have push data. Power BI also allows you to use APIs to push data into Power BI. In that case, data is pushed to Power BI and it will leverage in-memory engine, but it is staying inside of Power BI. The data lives there. So how does Power BI handle the data? In the majority of the cases, we talk about data in two different aspects. The data is either in process or at rest. And what it means is that when data is in process, it is working on some data. It's rendering the data to create a report. It is sending queries to the in-memory analysis service database that we're running in the backend to be able to retrieve data, but data is in memory. When the data is in process and the machine goes down, the data is lost, and it has to refetch it and has to do something again with it because everything is it's sitting in memory. It's only there for a short period of time. That's why we call data as in process. Data at rest, though, means data is stored somewhere. Your data is stored somewhere inside of the Microsoft Power BI cloud. That is data at rest. And we'll talk about data at rest in more details in a second. But as soon as we have data in transit between Power BI and the data source or Power BI and the clients, it is always encrypted through HTTPS. Depending on the data source itself, data may be stored in the service or retrieved just in time, but it's always encrypted. So this means that when we are doing a report that points down to the underlying SQL Server database or analysis services, the data is moved to Power BI through the gateway and things like this. It's always encrypted. And if you do caching in the middle using Power BI, then the data is also stored inside of Power BI, but again, it's always encrypted. And we'll talk about encryption more in a second. So, and this is where kind of the interesting part starts, because what types of data at rest are there? The data itself is the data set. So you import data, you import 6 tables from your SQL Server database into Power BI, into the data set. That is what we call the data itself. All the rows, all the millions of rows of data are stored in this data set, and that's the data. Then we need to have credentials that allows you to connect to the data source, to refresh, or in the case of the live connection, to be able to connect to the data source directly. The metadata is the report, the dashboard layout, or even the data set layout itself. It's all the data that is describing the model and the reports and the dashboard. It's not the actual data itself. The last part is something that we call the visual cache. The visual cache is used to cache dashboards. Today, all dashboards are cached. This can be tuned. As of a few months ago, you now can actually change how often dashboards can be refreshed. But all the tiles you see on the dashboard are in a cache stored inside of Power BI. So this can be tuned, and we're also working on features to be able to turn off caching completely in the dashboards as well. Of course, the idea about this is that the majority of your users in your organization are actually going to Power BI, and they look at a dashboard, and they look at it, and it says everything is green, and they will go away and go off and do their merry other things. So they will hit the cache. Where when you turn off the cache and they open up the dashboard, it actually needs to query the data source. And the data source can be your on-premise analysis services or your on-premise SQL Server in direct query mode. And those systems will get hit more heavily if you turn it off. But again, it's your consideration and you can do whatever you want. This feature is not there yet, but we're working on it. So these are the types of data at rest. So where is this data at rest stored? So let's talk about the first piece. The first one is easy. We have analysis services on-prem or Azure, doesn't really matter. And then we have for all the different types. So let's start with the data itself. When you have a Power BI report that is pointing to an analysis services database, no data is stored inside of Power BI. It's easy. The credentials to be able to connect to that analysis service database are stored in an Azure SQL database, and it's encrypted there. And we'll talk about encryption keys in a second. The last part is the metadata / visual cache. There's nothing stored except a reference to the database in Azure SQL, the one we talked about earlier. Again, it's encrypted. The visual cache, so if you create dashboards, that visual cache is stored in an Azure Blob Storage, and it's encrypted. And again, we'll talk about encryption keys in a second. So when you use analysis services, the only things that are stored is where do I need to go to? Like, what's the name of my analysis services database and how do I connect to it? Those are stored in Azure, encrypted. The visual cache, the dashboard cache, is the one that is there stored in an Azure Blob Storage, and again, it's encrypted. For direct query, again, it's very similar. There's no data stored inside of the Power BI service itself because we're using direct query. The credentials, and this is kind of different because there's two ways you can create direct query models. One, directly in the Power BI service, you point to an Azure database, you can get started, or when you use Power BI Desktop. When you use Power BI Desktop, the files are stored in, it's imported from desktop, it's stored inside of an Azure SQL database, encrypted. When the model is created in the service, it is stored as part of the connection string inside of the Azure Blob Storage. Again, the metadata visual cache, same thing as the other one. It's stored in Azure Blob Storage, and again, it's encrypted. So for direct query, no data is actually stored inside of Power BI, similar to analysis services. What is stored inside of analysis service, what is stored in Power BI is the visual cache, the information that is needed to render the tiles on the dashboard. That's a very minimal, highly aggregated information. The third one is push data. And push data is a non-direct query, non-IaaS on-prem, and this is using those APIs. Here, data is stored in an Azure SQL database, and it's encrypted. There are no credentials because we push data through the APIs. And again, metadata visual cache, same thing, stored in Azure Blob Storage, and it's encrypted. The last part is ETL of cache data, and this is the one that is most interesting. You create a Power BI desktop file, you import data into your desktop, and now you publish it to Power BI. Now the data itself actually lives inside of the Power BI service. That data then is stored inside of an Azure Blob Storage, and it's encrypted. The credentials to be able to refresh that data, it kind of depends on where the data comes from. But if you use things like Salesforce or OneDrive, the refresh tokens are stored in Azure SQL DB, encrypted. When you refresh the data set, so you use the refresh mechanism, they're stored in Azure SQL DB data set. When you don't refresh, there's nothing stored. Pretty simple and straightforward. And the metadata visual cache, again, is stored inside of an Azure Blob Storage. So, as you can see, majority of the items are stored in two different ways. Either in a blob store or in a SQL Server. And the way that the encryption works is, when we talk about Azure Blob Store, is the Azure Blob Store are signed with our keys and credentials. The encryption keys to the Azure Blob Store are stored and encrypted in a separate location in the Power BI service. This is fully managed by an internal Microsoft service that we have set up. That internal service at Microsoft is the one that is actually handling and managing and deploying and doing everything that needs to happen with those keys. There's no person, no developer of Microsoft that actually needs to put the hands on generating these keys. It's all automated process. So key rotations, new deployments to new servers, that we've set up, new tenants, all of these things, it's all automated. There's no manual labor involved. So no employee at Microsoft is actually touching these keys that are getting generated. The next part is the encryption keys for Azure itself. Of course, it's using Azure SQL Database, TDE technology. So the encryption of data at rest, the SQL Server database at rest, is managed by Azure SQL itself. We don't do anything here. The encryption keys for credentials are also interesting. And there's two different cases. On-prem data sources, it uses the data gateway on the customer's infrastructure, and we'll talk about this in a second. Or when you have cloud-based data sources, it's the data is stored inside of the data movement role using Azure SQL encryption. And the data movement role is the one that is actually doing refreshing of cloud sources. It's actually similar to the data gateway, but then it's we host it and rerun it in the services ourselves. Okay, so again, going back to encryption, SQL Server, it's pretty straightforward. We just use TDE. For Azure Blob, it's a little bit more complicated, but the most important thing to understand here, it's fully managed by an internal Microsoft service. We do not store the keys inside of our code base somewhere that a developer can come in and just look at that stuff. No, you really have to go through that Microsoft service. So it's all managed and automated. All right. So just taking a quick oversight as well on how the Power BI service is built up and the data storage, the backend is built up. Again, it's using two different ways to store data, either on an Azure SQL database or an Azure Blob. Azure Blob is for user uploaded data, and the Azure SQL DB is for metadata / some of the data. Again, the data in Azure DB has TDE enabled, and Azure Blob data is encrypted. It's also important to recognize and to notice, and again, just want to mention it, this again is very much covered inside of the Power BI security white paper as well. So more information you can find there. But there are only two services here. The Azure API management role and the gateway role are the ones that actually are connected to the internet. The rest is all internal to our own services. So the way that works is a user through the front end actually uses the Azure API management that goes through the gateway role. And then gateway role then talks to the presentation role or the data role. And then eventually, one of those services, it's kind of like a microservice, if you will, those will be able to get to the data in the end. Those are the only two places that data at rest are stored, in Azure Blob or Azure SQL database. The rest, data moves through, but it's only in memory. It will never be persisted to the disk. And it's only transient. So at one point, the data automatically disappears. Even if the system doesn't recycle, the data automatically disappears. Okay, so this is about data at rest, and this is about what data is stored. And of course, it's very important, and we'll continue on talking a bit more about this, because one of the ways for you to get data into Power BI is to connect to data sources. And one of the ways that you can connect to this data source, of course, is when you have using the on-premise data gateway. And the on-premise data gateway, and I see I need to update my slide because it still says Azure Analysis Services as preview, but it's now not as preview. Power BI, Power Apps, Flow, and Logic Apps, you all share the same gateway. And this one gateway allows you to connect to data sources on-prem. The way that it works is when you install the gateway, you type in this recovery key. This recovery key is part of the asymmetric key. The asymmetric key is used to encrypt and decrypt credentials. So when you go to Power BI and you go to the gateway, and you type in username and password there, that username and password is actually sent down, is actually encrypted on the server side using that ARC part of the key. Then when we actually need to refresh, the credentials are sent to the machine running the gateway on premises at the user's computer, where they are decrypted using those keys. So Power BI will never be able to decrypt the passwords in the service. It always only can decrypt the passwords locally on the data gateway machine. Now, when it has access to the data source and it retrieves only the data that it needs to render the visual, so again, the query is being sent to Power BI, and the query that's being sent only is needed to get to the data to visualize that particular report. It doesn't retrieve all the data, it's only a piece of it. Once the data has been retrieved, it gets sent back using data compression as well as transport encryption. So the data is moving between the data gateway and the Power BI service through an encrypted tunnel as well. So the important thing here to recognize is the on-premise data gateway is one, using encryption locally, so the passwords will only be able to decrypt locally, and the transmission between the services only sends the data that it needs to visualize the reports, and it goes through an encrypted tunnel. All right. Another very important topic here as well is where's my data stored? And again, mostly important in cases for Europe. But hey, let's say I want to know where my data is stored. How do I make sure the data is never going outside of my region? So the thing that you can do is once you sign up to Power BI for the very first time, then you can pick a region. In that region that you pick for the very first time, that is where your tenant will be created. Maybe someone in your organization already set up an Office 365. Power BI will recognize this and will create the tenant next to the Office 365 tenant in the same data center. But you can see yourself where your tenant is being created. You just go to the Power BI portal, you click on the question mark you see there, you click on About Power BI, and then you see the thing on the right. And here you see South Central US, Texas is where this tenant is being created. Now, once the tenant is being created, all the data will be stored in that region where the tenant is created. It doesn't necessarily mean the data is stored in that same data center. The way that works is that we always have at least two data centers in that same region. For example, here, when I look at Europe, in Europe we have two data centers, one in Ireland and one in West Europe in the Netherlands. One is always a backup of the other. But it will never be outside of the region. It will never be that you have a West Europe tenant that also has a US tenant, and that data then moves between the two. That will never happen. It's only within the same region. In this case, Europe region is West Europe and North Europe. When you're in Australia, and these are just some examples, in Australia, we have Australia East and Australia Southeast. Again, these two are backups of each other. We also have a data center in the UK, a region that's called UK. And there's two data centers in the UK, one in UK South and UK West. Again, when your tenant is created, because we're high available, we always need to make sure that for some reason that whole data center falls over. Let's hope it never happens. Then there's always a backup data center. And those are always within the same region. And this is what we call data sovereignty. It is very important for you to recognize, again, this is a moment in time recording that we're doing here. If you want to know the latest and greatest about this and want to read more about this, go search for Power BI Trust Center. The Power BI Trust Center is where you can get answers about all these questions. What is your data center? What is the region that belongs to that? And what are the other options? But they always are going to be within the same region. Power BI Trust Center is where you can see the latest and greatest information about this. All right, so that's about storing location and storing in the same region. The last part that I do also want to mention is that we also offer integration with another Azure service called Expressroute. Some people do not want to have any data between Azure and their location, their store or their company traveling through the internet. Because if I log in today, I'm talking to you today, and we're going through the public internet, I'm going to my ISP and it goes through some website somewhere and it routes through all kinds of parts of the internet. Let's say you do not want to do this, you can use ExpressRoute. ExpressRoute is another service in Azure that you can use to set up, and that means that you can create a private network connection from your organization to Power BI. Or you can use an ISP's co-location facility as well. Again, this is part of Azure ExpressRoute's functionality, and Power BI in this case will use its public peering feature. Again, there's a help document on this as well, ExpressRoute, lots of details. It is, in my experience, a pretty complicated setup, but again, this is probably mostly for those who actually really need the utmost protection. It is really interesting though, by the way. All right, ExpressRoute support. So the next part, of course, is also really important, is compliance and market availability. There's lots of things here. There's lots of compliance reasons and availability. The compliance, ISO, HIPAA, EU model clause, data processing terms, G-Cloud in the UK, SOX and Sarbanes-Oxley. We are working on these. They're coming soon, but as you might understand and might know, these are pretty lengthy processes. So they take quite some time to actually get through the entire process. So we're working on this. This is coming soon. FedRAMP High. So a lot of compliances, a lot of things. Again, this is all covered inside of the Power BI Trust Center as well. So probably at the time you're watching this right now, if you're looking at it live, this is up to date. If you come back 2 months from now, things will probably have changed and we'll add it more. Same thing goes for regions. These are all the regions that we have today. Again, this will probably change, so keep an eye on the latest and greatest. The other important thing is that some also have national clouds. For example, US government, China, Germany, they all have national clouds. We also offer this. All right, so compliance, again, Power BI Trust Center is the place where you can look at all of this. So the last couple of minutes, the last 10 minutes, I want to look into one last topic. First, we've covered how Microsoft secures your data when you have it sitting inside of Power BI. But how can you secure your data? Once you bring it into Power BI, you give it over to Microsoft, you can now share the data with everyone who you want. So that's also maybe a potential issue. So there's two aspects. Of course, Microsoft needs to do its part, but it's also important to recognize what you can do and how you can secure your data. So how can you secure your content? Well, I've kind of written down all of the possible ways that you can go ahead and share data, extend data. The first thing is, when you look at data in your workspace, it's yours alone. No one can edit it. It's your data, but you can share dashboards in your workspace with others to see. And they can only see it when you share the dashboards. And this can be inside or outside your organization. If you want to collaborate with others, you can create an app workspace. And what I've done here is I've used the latest terminology. There's a great blog post on app distribution by IJ on the Power BI blog that goes into the terminology and the naming here. I've tried to already start using this because we don't call the workspace anymore, we call it an app workspace. And when you create an app workspace, you can collaborate with others. So I can work with a team of people on the sales content, and we all have edit rights. We can all delete reports, create data sets, and so on. We can do it together, collaboration. Then you can distribute an app for consumption to users inside and outside of your organization using app source or direct URL. And again, this is similar to the content packs that we already know, where you can create and package up certain content and share it with others. The way that content packs work today is that you go get a content pack. That content pack then gets instantiated inside of your Power BI. So the lineage is lost between what is originally created and what you got from the content pack. With these new apps, you actually get a nice area where you can actually see and go back to the apps itself. The interesting part here is today you can go to get data and look at all the apps available in the app source. With the new app model, you can also get a link sent by someone. You click on the link and it opens up the app immediately for you. So you don't have to go get it. One thing that we're working on is also allowing people to just push an app directly to someone. The other thing it's important to notice here is also that we have an asterisk here to people to outside of your organization. We also want you to be able to share to people outside of your organization. The way that we're planning to do this, and again, this is covered in that blog post that I talked about earlier by Ajay on app distribution, but we're going to leverage Azure Active Directory B2B to allow you to share content to people outside of your organization. It's not there today, but it's coming. So this is about actual file access. So you give someone access to the files or not. But we have another function and capability that allows you to secure the rows of data using row level security itself. So this allows you to secure only parts of the content. Row, and we usually call it RLS, but the RLS means row level security. And it allows you to control what data a report user can see. So in this case, and this is a very simple example, of course, Jack, Anna, and Geoff all have access to my Power BI desktop file, my Power BI report that I've shared in the service. But when Jack looks at the data, he only sees the 2 yellow rows. When Anna looks at my data, he only sees the 3 orange rows. And when Jeff looks at my data, he only sees the white row. But they all have access to the same data. So you can create row level security, and I'll show you this in a second, to secure the data as such. This can be set up in Power BI itself, or this can be set up in Azure in analysis services, either Azure or regular analysis services. When you use analysis services, you can actually leverage some additional security. One of the recent announcements on the new Tabular model is that we now have object level security in the Tabular model. We already had object level security in multidimensional models. So this means that when Jack logs in, he can see the employee table. When Anna logs in, she cannot see the employee table. You can hide entire objects inside of the model. With analysis services, and I actually recently wrote some blog posts on this on kasperonbi.com, where you can actually go ahead and configure single sign-on. This means when someone connects to my analysis services model through Power BI, you can actually connect to the underlying data source using single sign-on. This means that the credentials travel all the way down through the underlying SQL Server database. And you can define row level security in the database itself. Or you can leverage some of the new capabilities and features that SQL Server has to offer, things like always encrypted or data masking, and you can configure those. And then the data will be encrypted in the SQL Server database, but only get decrypted as part of the analysis services service. So you can configure those using analysis services as well. So let's take a look at the RLS demo. So what I've done here is create a very simple model. And this model, of course, is by regions. And this is just regular Power BI desktop. And I've created 2 roles here. And what you can see here is I've created a Europe role and a North America role. And the Europe role, I've created a role that says dim sales territory equals Europe. This means whoever is part of the Europe role can only see data from Europe. But when you're part of the North America role, you can only see dim sales territory part of North America. So you create those roles inside of Power BI desktop, and you can test them as well. So I can go in here and say, okay, I want to view as if I'm part of the Europe role. Press OK. And now you automatically see data is filtered by just data from Europe. When I log in from Europe as a person who's connected to this role, I only see this data. I don't see the rest. Or when I switch to North America, I only see data from North America. I don't see anything else. Or when I can see everything, I see everything. So the way that it works is I created 2 roles. I've defined and declared the content here inside of the Power BI desktop file. And now I can share it to Power BI service. And in the Power BI service, I can actually go in and configure who has access to these roles. So maybe I have a group of users that are part of the Europe group. So I assign these users to this role. Now when they log in, they automatically only see Europe. Or the other way around, when I'm part of North America group, I can go to Power BI and assign people to this role. Then when they log into powerbi.com and they look at the report, they only see the data that they need to see. This is great when you have a pretty simplistic scenario the way that I showed you. You don't have much more than regions or things like this. This will be a lot of work when you want to, for example, start securing things like everyone inside of your organization, based on the department that they're in, they have special rights. Maybe you have a couple of thousand people. Now things become interesting, or you have like 80 departments. You're not really going to create 80 roles, right? So another trick that we have is something that we call dynamic role level security. And dynamic role level security is a feature that's been invented many years before I started with analysis services, that allows us to determine which rows of data are available based on data in the model. So instead of you creating that inside of the role definitions, you model it inside of your model. And I'll show you what it means. But what this means is you only have to create one role. You just have to model it as such, and it gets controlled by data. So when a new department gets added or people leave or anything like this, you just update the data, you automate it, and you refresh the data, and the new security system is in place. It reduces maintenance cost. This is something that, of course, is being used by the majority of our enterprise models. So what does it look like? So you can set up dynamic row level security by using bidirectional cross-filtering and a particular model that stores usernames. I'll show you an example in a second. But then you use a single DAX function called username to initiate the security. There are two functions available, and I'll show you an example in a second, but there are two functions available, the username function and a function called user principal name. And they both return slightly different results. The username function gives you domain/username, and the user principal name gives you the UPN. And the UPN is usually the user at Microsoft.com or in the email address. This is probably what you should use in Power BI, because that is, if you try to get the username function inside of Power BI, you'll probably get a GUID, and it's not what you want. So what does this look like? So let's say I have this simple scenario where you have a sales table. That sales table has a group, so sales are done by a group. The group has many users. A group can have many users, but many users can be in many groups as well. So this is a many-to-many relationship. Then I have a users table. Now, when a user logs into Power BI, we set up security that automatically filters the user table by the user who's connecting. That will filter the user table by this user. That in turn will filter all the other tables automatically based on the security that is being applied. This means that the sales are only showing data in the group where this user belongs to. There is a white paper, actually two white papers on this. There's one white paper called the Power BI bidirectional cross-filtering white paper. You can find this if you go to the Power BI documentation, and there's a part called resources there. And resources gets a link to white papers, and the white paper is there. It's called bidirectional cross-filtering. It explains this in details. There's also another white paper that got released last week. There's an update from an older white paper. It's called Securing the Tabular Model, which explains this in details as well. The last part as well is the model that you see here. I also have available on a blog post that is called the row level security cheat sheet. Dynamic row level security cheat sheet, where you can download this model and play with it yourself. So with that, let's actually go ahead and take a look at that workbook. So what I have here is that same model that I showed you earlier, where we have sales, groups, and users. The user table contains a few users. It's pretty hard to read right now, but it says user. We have 3 users in here. And it shows me a list of data: products, sales amount, groups, and users. And what I've done is created a single role, security role, where I say the users need to be filtered by username function. Let's test it. It's pretty straightforward to test inside of Power BI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say view as if I'm connecting as user at poc.onmicrosoft.com, and I'm part of the security role as well. So click OK. And now it automatically filters down the data as if I'm this user. If I do something else, if I do user 12, which does not exist, you won't be able to see any data. But if I do user 2, which does exist, okay, now you see different data. So again, this shows data based on who's connecting to Power BI and who's connecting to my model, based on this dynamic role of security. So this allows you to configure this dynamically. And again, there are some interesting blog posts and information available, so more reading. So Power BI Security Whitepaper is where you can go and get most of the information that I talked about today, especially the first part. The second one allows you to do dynamic row level security cheat sheet, which allows you to download what I just showed you. Then a white paper on bidirectional cross-filtering, again, talks about the security and how to set it up. Power BI and Expressroute document talks about setting that up. A security tabular model, white paper. And the last part is the blog post that I talked about earlier about IJ to secure to do the Power BI distribution. I will add this to the YouTube video a little bit later on, so you can actually see this. And I think I'm already a few minutes over time. This concludes today's webinar on Power BI security. Chuck, is there anything, any open questions that we can answer? All right, and with that, I'm gonna thank you for your attention and thank you for your time.